We're in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. We had gone through the first couple of verses as Paul's coming in to them was not in vain, verse 1. It was successful. Of course, any time that the gospel is preached, it's successful. But he reminds them in verse 2 what had taken place prior to his coming to Thessalonica. He had suffered and was shamefully entreated at Philippi. But that did not prevent him from preaching the gospel. Says, we were still bold in our God to speak unto you the gospel of God, even though it was with much contention. Anytime Paul went and preached the gospel to anyone, they had contention. It caused, some of us put it, a riot or repentance. And I think that's a little bit inaccurate. It caused both all of the time. It caused riots, but it also called people to repent. Verse 3 then builds upon that. For our exhortation was not of deceit, nor of uncleanness, nor of in guile. The word for is a little Greek word gar, and it means it's a conjunction of explanation. Joins a couple of things together. But this then becomes an explanation of what he's just stated, that they were bold in their preaching of the gospel of God. Why? Because here's the reason. Our exhortation was not of deceit, nor of uncleanness, nor in guile. Look at that word exhortation. It's an interesting word. It is part of the work of a preacher, is that of exhortation. It's from a Greek word paraklesis. Literally means, you might recognize the root word kalesis or kaleo, is a verb form to call. Here, the noun form, kalesis, call or calling. And then you have the prefix para, which means beside. So it literally means, from the word, to call beside. This calling beside is used in different ways, though. For example, in John the 14th and the 16th chapters, the Holy Spirit is referred to as a comforter. It comes from this word, paraklesis. He's our comforter. In 1 John 2, it talks about Christ being our advocate. The word advocate there is the same Greek word. And if you remember preachers talking about that word in 1 John 2 and verse 2, that he is our advocate, you probably, or you might remember, that they use the idea of he is like a lawyer today who stands beside us to plead our case. Well, that's this word that is here, exhortation. McGarvey and Pendleton in their commentary wrote, the word exhortation has a double significance. It includes the idea of rousing the slothful and also that of comforting the sorrow or sorrowful. So there's this two-way aspect of exhortation. Rousing the slothful, getting them moving. But then those who are sorrowful, giving comfort to them. In Lipscomb's commentary, Shepherd added this to his comments. The word exhortation has a twofold signification, but denoting both exhortation and consolation. When it refers to moral conduct, it denotes exhortation. But when it is addressed to a sufferer, it denotes consolation. In the gospel, the two meanings are blended together. In the gospel, thus, both ideas are presented. You want to, those individuals who are not living as they should, you want to give them exhortation. You want to give them a exhorting. We might put it in our vernacular, they need a good kick in the pants. Now then, we all understand that terminology. Well, that's what preaching, exhortation is all about. It's giving people who need it a good kick in the pants to get them moving, to get things done, to get them living in the right way. However, there's that aspect of sorrow. They don't need so much that kick in the pants. They need comforting. They need somebody to come up and throw an arm around them and just be with them. Understand what you're going through. Sorry about it. And giving them comfort in that regard. The gospel does both. The work of a preacher is that of, thus, exhortation, comforting the bereaved, but stirring up those who need to be encouraged to live right. But it is a word that has a variety of meanings depending on context. Hard to give it just a singular definition because of that. Paul mentions here three things which his exhortation did not include. 1, deceit, 2, uncleanness, and 3, guile. Deceit. It's from a word which means error, delusion, or deceptive belief. Now, just as an aside, I've got to mention that there is a doctrine that has been going around for several years now. Some have termed it biblical ethical deceit. One person took the first letter of that biblical ethical deceit and said, yes, that puts you in bed with Satan, which is about right. But this idea of biblical ethical deceit says that it's all right to deceive people. Now then, understand, they would say all lying is sin. But not all deception is lying. In going to some of their arguments, you might be surprised. You might not even know how to answer them. I'll give you one, for example. Samuel had anointed Saul as king. God removed him, but he was still alive, still king. God tells Samuel to go and anoint someone. He's going to show him who? The house of Jesse. Samuel basically tells God, if I go, Saul will kill me. God tells him, you tell Saul that you're going to go offer sacrifice. Samuel did go and offer sacrifice. But he also went to anoint David as king. Did Saul or did Samuel deceive Saul? Not laughing as much now. You see, there's several of those situations where, how do we answer that? Was Saul deceived? Yes, he was. Did Samuel lie to him? Absolutely not. How do we reconcile that then? Number one, it's never called deceit. So exclude that word out of the context of what happened there. Saul did not deserve to know what Samuel was going to be doing. Samuel had no obligation to tell him, I'm going to go anoint someone as king to take your place. Had no obligation to tell him that. I'm not sure how that applies, but as a result, when he tells him, I'm going to go offer sacrifices, that's exactly what he did. He did not tell him all that he was going to do because Saul did not deserve to know that information. He had, by his actions and by what both Samuel and God knew that he would do, he had shown himself unworthy of having that information. Because that would have led to further sin on his part. And so while Saul was deceived, it was a self-deception, as if that's the only thing that Samuel was going to do. So God instructed him to allow, and try and word this in the best way, to allow Saul to deceive himself in that regard. But if you look at deception, deceit in the Bible, it is never used in a positive way. It is always used in a sinful way. Thus, this idea of biblical ethical deceit. And I believe there's several brethren who will use that idea of biblical ethical deceit today to allow you to think something that is not the case. In some controversies, I've told people, unless you ask a question in a specific way, you're never going to know the truth. And they didn't know how to answer the question or ask the question, and thus they didn't learn the truth on the matter. Why? Because that person that they were asking, while they didn't lie, they allowed them to be deceived in what they believed. But deceit, as far as the Bible is concerned, is wrong. It's sinful. Paul was not going, Paul, Silas, and Timothy, all three of them, our exhortation, he uses the term there, was not of deceit. He was going to teach something doctrinally to cause them to believe something that was wrong. His doctrine was out in the open. Generally, people will use that idea of biblical ethical deceit to try to deceive people as to what they believe, what they teach. And that's why you have to know the proper question and the way to word that question properly in order to find out what they really believe. Because they won't lie, because they know lying is sin. All lies are sin. So they won't lie, but they won't really let you know the truth. Paul wasn't like that. It was very open, honest. Here's what the gospel teaches. He didn't have any need to teach error or to deceive people. Raymond Kelsey in his commentary pointed out, it does not have reference to honest error, but rather to wrong-mindedness. Preachers, teachers make honest errors all the time. I don't know how many times an honest error, but it's still an error, that I have stated the wrong chapter or the wrong verse number. Is that error? Well, it wasn't the verse that I meant or that I referenced. But yet, it's certainly honest. I'm not trying to deceive anyone. There's honest errors that we make. We might say something the wrong way and not mean it. Thus, there are those honest errors that are being made. Sometimes you have Moses building an ark or crossing the Red River. I've had that one, or said that one plenty of times too, and didn't realize it until I see people laughing. Yeah, that's it. We're seeing if people are listening and paying attention. That's the reason we do it. And I still have to be very careful about the rich man asking to have Lazarus tip the dip of his finger in water and cool his tongue. Now, some of you caught that, I know, because I saw you laugh. And I remember the first time I did that, toward the end of a sermon or his lectureship in California. And there's three of my good friends sitting right back at the back there. And they just about fell out of the seat laughing. And I'm up there wondering, what in the world is so funny? Well, I found out after the fact. Honest errors are one thing. Teaching something that is doctrinally wrong is another matter. Paul, Timothy, Silas, they would not do that. So it was not of deceit. Second thing he says, it's not of uncleanness. The Greek word here, the Greek word here denotes moral uncleanness or sexual impurity in particular. Paganism was often associated with sexual immorality, fornication. Corinth is a good example. You had the temple outside of the city of Corinth that had, one historian said, 1,000 priestesses that served that temple. Every night, those 1,000 priestesses would come down into the city, and if a man wanted to worship that idol, they had sex with that priestess. That was how they worshiped. So when Paul says it's not of uncleanness, these people knew exactly what he meant by that. There wasn't any of this type of sexual immorality that was associated with idols. It just didn't happen with them. But he does use a word which goes beyond just that sexual impurity to any type of moral impurity. Some of those which have been suggested are things like greed, ambition, vanity, pride, honor, popularity, and you could probably go on and on with a lot of other terms that people, that's their motive of life. Paul says that wasn't ours. It wasn't of uncleanness. How many today preach and teach for such uncleanness? Think about, the obvious illustration, the televangelist. They do it for money, for the prestige that they can have, so that they can buy their multi-million-dollar jets and fly around the nation or the world. And one, when questioned about them, because he was selling one jet to buy another bigger jet, was questioned about it, and he made the comment that if Jesus were around today, he'd be flying in his own jet too. Well, look at the life of Jesus, and you know that's not the case. I've used the illustration that this was back in the probably 1970s. A guy on television I saw it in the Dallas area. He wanted you to send $1,000 to him. I was when $1,000 went a whole lot farther than it does today. And if you did, then you would put God in your debt to do whatever you wanted. Now then, sad thing about it is he got the $1,000 so many times. Why was he preaching? For money. And in listening to some of these people, it amazes me how they can work money into any passage, just about. You talk about any passage, they're going to work money into it, and you sending them money. Well, that's preaching for uncleanness purposes. Wasn't it Oral Roberts who told Brother George Darling, you go ahead and preach your truth and eat your beans, was it? and I'll sit here in my $1,000 chair. Well, it's amazing what these people will do for their money. That is just pure uncleanness, and deals with that. But it's far more. You could look at others, and it would be the prestige that they have. I will say that preaching does not have the prestige that it once had. Preachers were once held in very high esteem. You don't see that as much anymore because of the ungodliness of so many of these so-called preachers, and they're preachers of error. But Paul is saying we didn't have any of that. What was he preaching for? He was preaching for the salvation of their souls, because he had that need to preach the gospel. Then he says, not in guile. The idea of guile is that of subtlety, craft, trickery, fraud, uncleanness would deal more with the improper motive, their purpose in their preaching. Guile would have more to do with the improper means of accomplishing. Means or method, either way. I wrote an article not too long ago answering a letter that I received about using entertainment to draw people in. And I use this passage, that's guile. I'm going to draw you in by these baseball games and by sports and by our gymnasium that we built and all of these other areas of recreation. Or let's take them to, well, in Texas it was Six Flags. Here it's a little bit far for Disney World. But someplace like that. We're going to take you there. Well, that's guile. Because we're going to get you here under these pretenses, and then we're going to try and slip the gospel into you. There was a radio program, nationwide radio program that came up. This was in the mid-1950s. Not 50s, 70s. And they never mentioned the Church of Christ, either in the program or in association with it. Why? Because that had negative connotations, and they wanted to be able to teach people without the negative connotations. That's guile. We're going to fraudulently get you in listening, and then try and slip the gospel into you and tell you, not even tell you what we are, who we are. That's the way denominations do it. That's not the way that the Lord's church should be acting. That which draws a person is that which is going to keep a person. When you draw a person with fun, food, and entertainment, you're going to have to keep that person the same way. The drawing power is is to be the gospel. It's to be Christ and Him crucified. Sometime go back to 1 Corinthians, the 1st and 2nd chapters, and read how that Paul says, I know nothing but save Jesus Christ and Him crucified. This is what I'm preaching. This is what I'm teaching. Under the Greeks, it's foolishness. Under the Jews, I've forgotten the word that he used. But they didn't like it, neither one. But all that he would preach is the gospel.
Jews ask for a sign, and others seek after the other.
I don't think he uses a sign there, though, in 1 Corinthians 1. But either way, he wasn't going to try to draw them in with guile and then try and slip the gospel into them. It was very open. This is what I'm appealing to, the gospel. Jesus Christ and Him crucified. That's the way we need to be. When you draw people by the gospel, then it's going to take more and more of the gospel to keep them. Which then leads to the aspect of that growth and development in Christianity. If I am drawn by, let's say, a church league softball team, number one, how's that going to develop me spiritually? It doesn't. If they want to keep me and my interest, since my interest was there and that's what drew me, guess what they're going to have to keep doing? Providing recreation and entertainment for me. If, however, we appeal to the Scriptures, say, here's what the Scriptures say, and I am drawn to Christ because of that, then I want more and more of the Scriptures. And I'm going to study and I'm going to learn the truth in regards to the Scriptures. So Paul says, when we came to you, our exhortation, our words which we used did not come from deceit, weren't intended to deceive you. They were not of uncleanness in any way. They were not in guile. What was it? It was simply verse 2, going back to that, bold in our God to speak unto you the gospel of God. In looking at verse 3, there's a change in prepositions. Of deceit, of uncleanness, in guile. That's based upon the Greek words. The word of, in both of those cases, of deceit and of uncleanness, is the Greek word ek. And most of you probably remember that from ecclesia, which is the church. Klesis, again, to call, and then ek, the prefix, out from within. When you get to in guile, it uses the Greek word in. Now then, the change focuses from the source of the appeal. It's not out from within deceit. It's not out from within uncleanness. There's the source of the appeal. The appeal for what? For them to become Christians, to obey the gospel. when he gets to in guile and changes it, it is the means by which the appeal is made. And so it doesn't arise from deceit or uncleanness. The means by which it is made is not in guile. So he makes a change there that we might not notice, but is an important change that's there. And I will kind of add, a lot of times we just read over things without looking at the actual words that are there. God used these words for a specific reason, and we need to pay attention to them. In verse 4 then, he continues on, but as we were allowed of God to put in trust with the gospel, even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God, which trieth our hearts. There is a strong contrast that is made here between verse 3 and verse 4. You see that with the word but. It's not of deceit, not of uncleanness, not in guile, but, here's the contrast, as we were allowed of God to be put in trust with the gospel. The word allowed is a Greek word which means to examine, to put to the test, to judge as good. We were allowed. We were put to the test. We were judged as good. Bauer, Danker, Arndt, and Gingrich in their dictionary defines it: one, to make a critical examination of something, to determine genuineness, put to the test, examine. And then 2, to draw a conclusion about worth on the basis of testing, proving, or prove, approve. Here, the focus is on the result of a procedure or examination. We were allowed of God. We were put to a test to determine the genuineness of this, to see the results of it in their preaching and teaching, that it was of God. That's what was tested. And we'll kind of end with this thought, we are to test, put to the test people and what they teach. Jesus at the very beginning, Matthew the 7th chapter, taught that there's going to be wolves in sheep's clothing. How do you determine if a person is a sheep or if he's a wolf in sheep's clothing? Got to test him. Got to make sure that what he says is right and is accurate. I'm not sure what all they did, because I just gave the money to Ilya and he went and changed it. Marks, yeah. I remember when I was going there that I was told very specifically, only you bring $100 bills and make sure they are brand new. No marks, no nothing on them. Otherwise, they wouldn't change them. They put it to the test to make sure that it was true. Make sure that it's approved. John, the apostle of love, in 1 John 4, what do you say in verse 1? Believe not every spirit, but try, put to the test the spirits, whether they are of God. We have far too few that put what is being said to the test to make sure it's true. They just simply accept what is being said. And that's wrong on our part when we do so. We always have to put it to the test. Paul says we were put to the test. We were allowed of God. And so I hear the second bell not ringing. So we will stop at that point and pick up, Lord willing, next week with that.